Anyone here not know this story? It's one of the most widely known stories in the Bible. And secondly, you heard David reciting his song, the well-known 23rd Psalm. Wow, who was this lowly shepherd boy and what did he grow up to become? Well, we'll delve into that this morning with his story, with a specific look at his leadership and what we can learn from that. You know, David is not only revered in our faith, but also in other faiths. He is spoken about in Islam. David is a highly important figure in Islam as one of the major prophets sent by God to guide the Israelites. David is mentioned several times in the Quran, often with his son Solomon. The actual Arabic equivalent to the Hebrew David is Dawood. In the Baha'i faith, David is described as a reflection of God and one among a long line of prophets who came in the shadow of Moses to develop and consolidate the process that Moses had set in motion. They describe David as being among the more exalted manifestations who appeared between the intervening period between the revelations of Moses and Muhammad. So who was he? What did he do? What can we learn from him? David was the youngest of 7 sons of Jesse of Bethlehem and spent his time working in the fields herding sheep. It was during this time that he not only communed with God in his lonely herding task, but also learned tactics to outmaneuver the wolves who sought to take his sheep. Here's a bit of trivia. Of the 150 Psalms in the Bible, 73 were written by David, some as he tended his sheep. The first leadership quality is communing with God for godly advice. David did that. King Saul, who was in power at that time, had lost direction with the Lord and as such had lost favor with God. In the video up there, he was the king that was talking to David. That was King Saul. The prophet Samuel, under God's direction, sought a new king from one of the 7 sons of Jesse. When he saw David, he knew he had found God's chosen one. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him. Did you know that God scans the world seeking potential leaders? Thankfully, God is not looking for perfect people, since there is no one who is perfect on this earth. Rather, God is seeking ordinary people to carry out an extraordinary task. He is looking for people with certain qualities, those qualities being leaders who have qualities of spirituality, devoted hearts, and humility. A mistake was made with the making of Saul king. He was made king because he was tall and he looked like one. Whoops. However, he did not listen or act as the Lord wanted. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 13 and 14, it is said, "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Further in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14, the Bible says as punishment for being an unworthy king, Saul was tormented by an evil spirit from the Lord, likely migraine headaches. It was suggested to Saul that he send for David, a young warrior famed for bravery and his lyre playing. Saul did so and made David one of his armor bearers. From then on, whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, migraine headache, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul, and he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. We just saw the clip of the famous David and Goliath battle, where Saul's army, through David's courage, turned back the Philistines. From this act of bravery, David was made a commander in Saul's army. Second leadership quality demonstrated was courage. David was very successful leading Saul's army in war and won many battles. This was partly due to his tactics he learned from herding sheep and outmaneuvering the wolves, and his ability to lead people. He worked to create teamwork, clear direction, and integrity in all he did. He partnered with others to create common goals. He was a leader who cared intently for those he led. He shepherded people. One would think that Saul was pleased with this, but since he was paranoid, he looked at David as a threat to his leadership. The people chanted in the streets, "Saul has killed thousands, and David his tens of thousands." True, David was being praised and exalted as a great leader and a warrior by the people, but he really had no designs on the throne at this time. He did, however, get to see a negative leader. Mark talked about negative values, a negative leader in Saul, one who is not in tune with God. David had spent his time tending sheep in lonely pastures and communing with God, going ever deeper in his relationship. Does this remind you of what Marjorie has been saying about creating a deeper relationship with God through this fall's program, Faith Forward? Well, it should. Saul's paranoia got the better of him, and he conspired to have David killed. David was warned about this and fled into the wilderness, gathered a band of followers, and was the champion of the oppressed while avoiding Saul's pursuit. 1 Samuel 22, verse 1 and 2. But those who gathered to David initially were not the elite, highly skilled, or usefully trained. They were instead those who were in distress, debt, and despondency. David employed his leadership gifts to hone these unlikely candidates for greatness into men who would alter history. As leaders, we don't always work with the gifted, but by creating a clear vision of where we are going, mission, vision, values we use to get there, and then coaching, mentoring, praising, correcting, and teaching, we can make people successful. Sound like St. Paul's? You bet. Saul was killed in battle by the Philistines, and his son Ishbosheth was named king of Israel. David, with his popularity, leadership, and teamwork, was named king of Hebron. And as usual in those days, fighting broke out between Hebron and Israel. Some of David's followers thought they had the answer, so they assassinated Ishbosheth and brought his severed head to David, expecting to be honored. But David did not agree with this tactic, and they all lost their lives as a result. Even in war, David followed a moral code. Third leadership quality, integrity. In Acts 13:22, it is said, "After removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, 'I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do.'" So David was declared king of Hebron and Israel through his popularity, his trust, his leadership, and his alignment with God. All should be happy, right? Well, leadership has its challenges. As we are all human, David had been anointed by God, and there were strict rules for him to follow. Remember God saying, "He will do everything I want him to do." He made Jerusalem his capital. Check. Made plans to bring the Ark of the Covenant there. Check. However, in those strict rules from God was how the Ark should be moved and by who. So one of the ark bearers was killed by lightning to show God's displeasure and remind David who he was to be serving. We all make mistakes. There are consequences, but God does forgive us, and we are given another opportunity. David did as God wanted, and the ark was moved properly, and all was well. Check. For now. Then along comes a married woman named Bathsheba. In the Bible, it says David saw her bathing and couldn't take his eyes off her. Her husband was away fighting in David's army, so David used his power and wiles to start an affair with her. When she became pregnant, he wanted to hide himself as his father, so he called Bathsheba's husband to come home from war to spend time with her, and maybe the infidelity would go unnoticed. But Uriah, the husband, was so loyal to David and his army that he would not go to his wife, but wanted to go back fighting with his men. When this plan failed, David did another despicable act. He had Uriah sent to the very front lines. Then his soldiers withdrew, and Uriah was left alone to be killed. Nice king, eh? Had he not learned any lessons about consequences of his actions? Well, God reminded him by taking his firstborn son with Bathsheba. What a price to pay. Fourth leadership quality: admit mistakes, be ready for consequences. God will give you a second chance. David made mistakes which negatively impact his credibility among his followers. His handling of his family affairs is an example of a growing leader making mistakes. As we heard from Mark 2 weeks ago, when Amnon violated his half-sister Tamar, David mishandled the situation, which led to brother Absalom killing Amnon and rebelling against David. Finally, Absalom is killed. Remember the big head of hair caught in the trees in a thickly wooded forest? These deaths would lead to a succession crisis at David's death, as both likely heirs were dead. A leader's mistakes can have long-ranging effects that cannot be foreseen. David did, however, follow Father Solomon, who came to be a wise leader, utilizing the positive skills he learned from his father and rebuking the negative traits he witnessed from David. As members of St. Paul's, we all have an opportunity to lead. Whether it's in our families, our jobs, or in our church, we can all at one time or another take on a leadership role. We can all shepherd others. We can learn from the positive attributes of David's leadership and focus on emulating these. Understand the negative attributes and avoid those. And do all this under God's direction by going deeper in our relationship. We can make ourselves and others successful. Who? Me? Yes, you. This week, as I thought of Nelson Mandela with his birthday on the 18th, thank you, Google, it reminded me, one of his quotes resonated with me. His quote was, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others. That will determine the significance of the lives we lead." So how do we do this? By spiritual practices of talking with God in prayer and daily reading the Bible, you will find opportunities and answers to direction for leadership in your life. I challenge you all to focus on that this week.